Hello and welcome. I'm Tracey Polowich, host of the Excellence Connection podcast, where we connect our listeners with subject matter experts, knowledge, and resources to help along the excellence journey and improve organizational performance. Today, my guest is Robin Mann, and we will be speaking about benchmarking primarily. Robin is founder and provider of global benchmarking and business excellence research, training, and consulting services. Welcome to the show, Robin.
It's good to be here, Tracey. Nice to speak to you.
Yes, and thank you for taking some time to join us and share your wisdom and knowledge on benchmarking and other subjects. Could you give us and the audience a bit of your background and tell us a little more about yourself?
Yes, originally from the UK, but I've been living in New Zealand the last 20 years. I did a PhD in total quality management, which was one of the first PhDs in total quality management anywhere in the world. That's between 88 and 1992. And that was when I guess the West was responding to what was happening, in Japan and Korea in terms of trying to revitalize businesses. So taking a lot of learning from those countries to develop the philosophy of total quality management, which was then becoming, developing into or evolving into business excellence. So my PhD was at the start really of the development of the business excellence frameworks. So the Baldrige framework had just come out and the European Business Excellence Framework was being developed. And so my actually PhD research at the moment was really trying to understand what was total quality management, which became business excellence, because business excellence became an easier way to explain to people what TQM consisted of. And initially the models, the business excellence frameworks were called total quality management models, and it's just rebranding into business excellence models. So really that's where my career started off, my PhD, and then I worked in as a process improvement manager in a biscuit company, which in Edinburgh in the UK, and which was again really great experience, because then trying to apply some of the concepts I'd learned through my research. And following on from that, I then continued to work in the food and drinks industry as a consultant, developing initiatives for the whole food and drinks industry around quality management, business excellence, and benchmarking. So I started to run major benchmarking programs in the UK for the food and drinks industry. And then I was based near London. And then after that, I thought I wanted to leave the UK, and the opportunity came along to work at Massey University in New Zealand. So I took that opportunity, came to New Zealand, and whilst my focus initially was sort of education and just teaching, then my prime interest has always been working with industry. So again, I started many different initiatives to assist New Zealand businesses. I started a New Zealand benchmarking club and run many conferences and activities around quality. And now for the last 20 years, I've not worked, well, probably the last 15 years, not worked full time at the university. So I work 20% of my time there. I have a research center where I have PhD researchers researching business excellence and benchmarking and how organizations can gain knowledge from implementing best practices. But the other 80% of my time is sort of on my sort of own business, on a consultancy side, helping organizations to apply these concepts and share the knowledge. So that's it in a nutshell.
Nice, thank you. And yes, interesting. I've known you for a few years now, but I've not heard your entire history and your background. So it's good to get to know that better. So what can we just describe what is benchmarking?
It's just really learning from the experience of other organisations and applying that knowledge and helping you to improve your own process and systems. I think, it's always good to have a conversation with people about what their perceptions are of benchmarking, because there are different understandings of what it means. And a lot of people think benchmarking is just comparison. But it's much more than that. It is about, yes, there is going to be comparing what your organisation is doing against others, but it's making sure that learning that you get from that comparison is then applied inside your organisation, and you then evaluate the outcomes from applying that new knowledge. An easy way to think of it really is that the word benchmarking, you can split into two parts. So one part is a benchmark, which is a comparison against others or the comparison against standards. And so that is the benchmark, the comparison. But what you want to do is much more than that. And so the ING means that you go in the extra step, and you're then trying to make sure that learning is applied. And it's much more generally than the metrics as well. And the metrics, to say, is really trying to identify which organisations are potentially performing better than your organisation. And the ING is really learning about, why they are performing better. What makes the difference, and then I say applying that inside your own organisation. And this is where change management is a key component of benchmarking. I would say benchmarking is the most powerful change management tool there is.
So the ING is, adding different practices or applying a practice in a different way that is similar to the organization you're benchmarking against. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting good ideas, good practices from the other organisation. It's very rarely a straight copying. It's adapting them to your own organisation's business context, business environment, culture, and I think also, people tend to think that if you are doing, a benchmarking project, you're just copying maybe or adapting one or two or three or four different ideas from organisations, or you're going to get one fantastic idea or practice from another organisation and apply it in your own organisation. When I do benchmarking projects and involved in many benchmarking projects, generally every project would obtain between 50 to 120 ideas from doing a benchmarking project. And that's a combination of learning from other organisations, but also combining that with ideas that the benchmarking team have themselves by just focusing on the project. So this is why, because it creates creativity, mindset changes. When you do benchmarking, it opens your eyes, you listen to new ideas, and so yes, you learn great practices from other organisations, but it's combining that with good ideas from yourselves, your stakeholders you speak to. This is why you get so many ideas and practices that can potentially be implemented. And it's a case of really sieving through those and deciding which ones, we're going to implement, based on, the potential impact and ease of implementation.
And so that is really more comprehensive, like you're explaining, than just looking at certain comparisons. So can you describe some of the benchmarking tools that can be used?
Well, maybe I'll just describe how you do in a benchmarking project. So the methodology I actually developed when I first started the New Zealand Benchmarking Club many years ago. It was called the T.R.A.D.E. Best Practice Benchmarking Methodology. It's actually a PhD student of mine who came up with the name T.R.A.D.E. So it wasn't even, I took ideas from one of my students, but and we called it T.R.A.D.E. because when you do benchmarking, it's about really trading information and knowledge, forming partnerships with other organizations. So it's not a one-way street in terms of knowledge exchange. It should be the organization you're learning from as well. They should be getting something out of the relationship to encourage them to share more information with you at a greater depth. And so this is why we called it, T.R.A.D.E. It's trading information and knowledge to help to improve your products and services. And the T.R.A.D.E. is an acronym, and so the T stands for the terms of reference, therefore deciding what the project is going to be focused on, and I guess how important that project is and how much resource you want to put into it. So it's having clarity around that. The review, the R is for review, reviewing your current situation. Because before you go to learn from other organizations, you need to know exactly what is the challenge or opportunity you're facing. And then A is for acquire, which is acquire best practices, which is a learning from other organizations. Then the deploy, the D is for deploying the better practices that you found or the new ideas. And then E is for evaluating the outcomes of the project. And so at each of those stages of the benchmarking project, there are specific tools and methods that can help you proceed along the benchmarking project. And so when we do a benchmarking project, there is like a project management system, which within each side of, for each stage of the benchmarking methodology, for instance, in terms of reference stage, there are 9 steps you have to follow through. And then for the review stage, there's again, I think it's 5 steps, the acquire stage, 9 steps. So it's quite a very prescriptive approach that you follow through, just making sure that you do research, which is essentially what a benchmarking project is, in a professional manner. But because the stages and steps have been clearly identified, then you haven't got to be thinking about how do we do good research, because the methodology already directs you in the way to do the good research. And when you go through those stages and steps, there's specific tools and techniques you use. And so, for instance, in the review stage of T.R.A.D.E., reviewing your current situation, then there's techniques you might use like SWOT analysis, fishbone analysis, gap analysis, to identify exactly what the problems are. So this is right through the whole of benchmarking. There are these various tools and techniques. The methodology T.R.A.D.E. is really no different than any other benchmarking methodology. It's probably I would say it's more prescriptive in many senses, more comprehensive and more detailed. But all benchmarking methodologies generally follow whether a similar approach, whether it's the Xerox approach, which Dr. Robert Camp, who's a pioneer in benchmarking, initially helped to develop. They all follow a similar sort of approach.
Sounds like it just makes it very easy for people to follow, and is a great resource for those businesses that are maybe just starting out to work on this, as well as those that are more advanced as well as also. But it sounds like a great resource for people to access. And
I would hope
how
so.
about, yeah, how about how does an organization decide or determine what they should measure, what they should research into benchmarking?
Well, I think it's just what they consider to be a real challenge that they're facing inside their organization at that current period of time. So benchmarking is an extremely flexible, approach. It can be used to improve a process. It can be used to help you to implement a new strategy. It can be used to change your organization's culture. So it can be used for any specific problem an organization has. And it's just really getting your organization to to look externally, look outwardly in terms of, what can we do differently? What haven't we thought of before? So it helps you to well, it helps to add creativity really to address often problems that have been there for a long time, and maybe you've already tried sort of standard continuous improvement approaches to tackle that problem. So benchmarking can, bring through breakthrough improvements, radical change through looking at how other organisations in other industries have addressed a problem, probably in the similar areas to yours, but previously you'd just be focusing on what your own organisation has been doing. Maybe you've been looking inside your own sector of what other organisations are doing, but benchmarking really challenges you to look at the problem from a totally different perspective, engaging other organisations as part of this from other industries as well to come up with breakthrough improvements. This is why I say every project that I've been involved in, it's just been so rewarding because it's generating so many ideas and practices, and then the decision is really, okay, which ones of these are we going to go forward with and actually implement? And the other aspect of it is that to do any project well, there has to be quite a bit of planning initially. So that's the hardest part of any project really, is deciding, as you say, what should we focus on, because every organisation has a multitude of problems, so there has to be some prioritisation around that, and that's why the review stage of T.R.A.D.E is quite thorough to get consensus on what we want to focus on. So you are using techniques like, say SWOT analysis and fishbone analysis to get agreement of what areas are most important. The other aspect is that when you're looking at those challenges, is to engage with all your key stakeholders. So every benchmarking project, you should have a project sponsor who's firstly can enable you to spend time on the project and probably form a team of people to work on that project. But it also ensures if you're engaging with that project sponsor, who's usually from the senior management team, then they are fully behind the project and know what's happening as the project proceeds. And so this is key for change management, to make sure you're always fully informing, your key stakeholders. In addition to the project sponsor, you'd have identified other key stakeholders who are either process owners or customers or suppliers of that process. And so again, at every single step of the benchmarking project, you're engaging with all the stakeholders. So what you're doing is, when you do a benchmarking project, you might just have one or two people, or even a small team, well, one or two people with the smallest team of people working on a project. But you might have, for a larger organisation, it might be 6 to 8 people as part of the benchmarking team. But really the team, even though they're focusing most of the time in a project and they're utilising these tools and techniques, they will be engaging all the other stakeholders who are going to be impacted by the project in the project as well. So actually the benchmarking team is very big, because you should be involving everybody who's going to be affected by the change process. So you identify all the stakeholders right at the start, and you think about how we're going to communicate with them, how we're going to engage with them, to make sure that what the area that we're focusing on is the right area, and to engage all the stakeholders when we come up with some ideas and new practices, that we're getting their input too. They could even be involved in visiting other organisations, if you're going to visit other organisations. So you'd be thinking all along the project, how can we engage with stakeholders in the various activities, so that when you identify the best practices or the better ways of doing things, then there's ownership, not of just the benchmarking team to those new ideas, but all the stakeholders are engaged in this whole process too. So everybody is going on this learning journey together, not just this small team, all your stakeholders. So when the best practices are found, there's sort of a consensus that this is what we want to do. and then that continues then on to implementation. And this is how it's such a powerful technique. A lot of organizations would use consultants to come up with best practices and get their advice on what to do. And yes, consultants have great advice and are often very knowledgeable about what the latest practices are to address a particular problem. But eventually they leave that organization, and you wouldn't get the same level of ownership or understanding of that that new practice, or the same knowledge in terms of how it can be implemented. So benchmarking to me it's not only coming up with these ideas and practices, but it's also about developing the team and developing the stakeholders around the team with the competencies and capabilities to implement the practice and sustain it in the long term.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that technique is powerful in the engagement and ingraining in the culture of the organization, for sure. And so going back to, you mentioned with the T.R.A.D.E methodology that it should be a two-way street. Can you tell me obviously the learning organization is getting benefit. How was the other organization, the one that's sharing their wisdom and knowledge, how are they benefiting specifically?
So often there's an enormous amount of cross learning. Number one, I think just by the fact you're asking another person, another organization questions about a particular process, then it stimulates that other person to think about how can we improve our process even further. A lot of organizations who are doing the benchmarking activity, they go back to the same benchmarking partners again and again. So they might have a core set of benchmarking partners who might be between 10 or 15 organizations, and they start to develop quite a strong relationship between them. And so whilst you might be going to that organization to learn, for instance, about HR processes, and because of this stronger relationship, they might be then coming back to you to learn about your best practices, which might be in another area of your business. There's a whole host of reasons why people might share. There's simpler things as well. For some organizations, you might just say, well, as a result of this, we'll take you out for a drink or take you for a meal as saying thank you very much. But the other aspect of this is that the easiest way to learn from another organization or get access to another organization is if you've already got a relationship with them. So a lot of the benchmarking that is done is between an organization's customers or suppliers, because you've already got a relationship with them. And generally with those organizations, you sort of already know or have some understanding what potentially they're good at. Right. And so often you can see straight away when you're doing that benchmarking along your supply chain, there's automatically some mutual sort of advantage from that sharing taking place and that strengthening of relationship. But even if they're outside your industry, you've got no contact with them previously, then I think there's always a way generally to get inside another organization. If you can't, it's normally that organization's not good in that area already.
They don't have that same sharing and learning culture, it sounds like, right?
Well, if they don't have that same sharing and learning culture, they're probably not then what really do you want to learn from them in many cases?
Yeah. And how about examples? Do you have any examples of successful benchmarking exercises that you could share with us?
So the last 5 years, been working a lot with the Dubai government and undertaken 35 benchmarking projects. One of the recent projects was, which I think everybody will sort of understand its importance, was when the COVID pandemic started. Then the Dubai government wanted to put in place the best approach to address the COVID pandemic at a governmental level. And so it was decided to form a benchmarking team using the T.R.A.D.E methodology, and to engage individuals who'd been responsible for what are called 7-star benchmarking projects. World-class benchmarking projects have been part of this initiative of 34, 35 projects in the past. So we brought together people very experienced in utilising the T.R.A.D.E methodology to form a team. And they were going to have to do the benchmarking project very, very quickly, because obviously the pandemic was just starting at this point. And you can't wait 1 month, 1 year or something like that to find out what needs to be done. And it's a moving target all the time. And so a team was quickly formed, and reporting directly back to the Crisis and Disaster Management Committee of the Dubai government. And initially, while straight away what was realised is that there were many challenges in terms of addressing the COVID pandemic. And whilst we'd formed a small team of, I think initially about 8 people, we realised straight away this was not enough. And then we broke this one team then into 5 different teams, and I had about 50 people working on the project. And so rather than looking at the COVID pandemic as a whole, we then had one team focusing on crisis leadership, crisis management, one team focusing on societal behaviour, which obviously needed to change, another team just focusing on the health issues related to the COVID pandemic, another team focusing on the food supply and supply chain issues. I've forgotten another team was focusing on the economic recovery. So 5 separate teams. And this is what happens with a benchmarking project. You identify what the component parts are that need to be addressed. And then even then you break them down even further. So in terms of crisis management, then they wanted to find what are the best practices in terms of crisis leadership, what are the best practices in terms of using various media channels, sharing the knowledge amongst the population. What are the best practices in terms of future foresight, so that in future when we have issues we can better plan for them. And then for each of those elements, then you look at, who can we learn from? So, if you're looking for crisis leadership, then it's not necessarily looking at other countries which are doing better, in terms of addressing the COVID pandemic, which, yes, you would be learning from them, but it might be also looking at other crises in the past, and where have leadership teams successfully address those crises in a short time frame, and address them in a way that have had minimal impact for the population or the environment which was affected by that crisis. So this is why it's so important, to break down into component parts the areas you'd focus on, because then you can learn from different industries, different sectors. So this was quite a wonderful project, because, as I say, it was learning from around the world, which countries were addressing the pandemic very effectively, but then also looking totally outside the pandemic, looking at other organisations or other issues which have been addressed previously, whatever they may be, and how can we apply that knowledge to improve Dubai's approach, and Dubai, and the UAE as a whole has been one of the most successful in terms of the recovery from the pandemic, and quickly addressing the health issues with respect to the pandemic as well. Related to that, they were one of the fastest in terms of introducing, the screening centres into the UAE. I think they introduced about 20 or 30 large drive-in screening centres within 18 days after they learned from Korea, but applied, I think, better practices and the Korea practices to allow greater throughput of people in a faster time, and to then provide health assistance more quickly if indeed they did have COVID. So I think that's and again there's a best practice report on that as well that we produce too.
Great, I'll put some links to some of these resources in the video. That just sounds so interesting and such an out-of-box sort of way of thinking about these topics. So it's a good example, I think, of, we didn't have historical or like for like information to go by, and so this methodology seems like a very appropriate tool to use, and gather information from whatever sources could be found that apply to the certain segments of the problem, right?
Yeah, and we've got there's a whole raft of information that we have on benchmarking and learning from best practices, and in our sort of website resource, that's the best practice improvement resource, bpir.com, and so that's got hundreds of case studies, thousands of best practices. It's got benchmarks, it's got tools you can use, self-assessment tools you can use when you're doing a benchmarking project. So yeah, it really is. So it really assists an organisation who wants to learn about more benchmarking, or assist when you're doing an actual benchmarking project and searching for best practices. This is one of the challenges that I'm trying to address, is helping organisations find relevant best practices that are appropriate to their particular circumstances. And so one of the things is that we obviously provide this website resource, which can be very helpful to organisations when they're doing a benchmarking project. But we also run what's called the International Best Practice Competition. And this is where organisations are encouraged to share their best practices in a very simple manner through writing a very simple application, but then sharing their best practice in an 8-minute presentation. So this is a neat way for many organisations to share best practice very quickly, and as they spark their interest in terms of whether this could be applicable to my own organisation or not. And each year we get between 60 to 80 best practices from all around the world as a result of that. And all of these are really nice presentations in different areas, and all those go into the bpr.com website resource. And so you can find some wonderful best practices, say whether it's in HR, leadership, customer services, moving to digital transformation, whatever it may be. And in addition to that, for those people that understand business excellence and business excellence models, all that information is searchable via the criteria of these models. So benchmarking and business excellence go hand in hand, really. So if organisations want to continually improve performance, then a good way is to be regularly assessing where they are on the journey to world-class performance for using an excellence model. And the excellence model would identify the key challenges or opportunities to improvement for an organisation, which then become the opportunity to do benchmarking projects within. So,
Right.
and then they can then search for best practices using, say, our particular website to define how can they address those challenges and then move forward to higher levels of performance.
That's such a valuable resource. And thank you for you and your teams for sharing all of that with everyone. The last question that I have for you, Robin, is how do you remain in the growth zone yourself? In other words, what do you do to deepen your own growth mindset?
Well, I think if you work in this field, you're always hopefully growing all the time. And I say I'm privileged to work with some wonderful people. I mean, all the various projects that I'm engaged with, then all of the project teams are just so motivated to improve their organizations, and it's so rewarding seeing these project teams go on this learning journey. And so whenever they go on the learning journey, then I'm by their side going on that learning journey too. So always constantly learning, and yeah, really we just want more people to do benchmarking, and the more people that do benchmarking, then the more people are also willing to share and willing to help other organizations. It is a two-way street, and we're a big world, and we should be trying to make the world healthier and more sustainable world for the future for everybody. And I think benchmarking helps to do that.
Fantastic. Robin, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time you've taken to share your knowledge and wisdom with all of us, and wish you all the best.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.